Alan, can you turn your camera off, please? Good evening, everyone. I'm Councillor Dave Davis, the Chairman of Joint Standards for TNBC. Welcome to this meeting of the Standards Committee. For the benefit of those watching our YouTube channel, members of the committee are present in the chamber, and these members will be voting on proposals, if any, this evening. The meeting will also be recorded via MS Teams in the case of any technical issues. Any members of the committee who are participating online via MS Teams can take part in any discussion, can ask questions, but they cannot vote. Similarly, other members of the council who are present in the chamber or participating online via MS Teams can take part in any discussions, ask questions, but cannot vote. Your attention is drawn to agenda item 1, which sets out the guidance on how meetings will be conducted. Before we start any formal business, we will confirm the attendance by voting members of the TNBC members. Victoria, please.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Present.
Apologies been received from Councillor Bell has been substituted by Councillor Williams.
Present.
Councillor Barton.
Present.
Apologies been received from Councillor Page has been substituted by Bishop.
Present.
Apologies been received from Councillor Councillor Hammond is not noisy by MS. Councillor Lark.
Present.
Councillor Parry.
Present.
Councillor Rhodes.
Here.
Councillor Roud. Councillor Turner.
Present.
Parish councillors. Addington. Apologies been received from participating by MS Teams. Borough Green. East Peckham. Adlow. Kings Hill. That. Blackstone participating by MS Teams. Wyash. Nodland. Whittlescliff. Bootham. Independent.
Thank you, Victoria. We go to the officers, please. Adrian.
Evening, Chair. I'm sorry to get my microphone to work. Sorry, Chair, if you can move on.
Victoria.
Freeman, Democratic Services Officer.
Okay, do you? Yes, right, sorry, yes. For the purpose of the record, I just note under item 3 that Councillor Bishop is substituting for Councillor Bridge and Councillor Williams is substituting for Councillor Bell. Are there any, on item 4, any declarations of interest? Okay, then moving on then to the minutes. I'm asking you if you regard the minutes to be a correct record of last time's meeting. Are you agreed? Any dissenters? There are no dissenters. The minutes are agreed. Moving on then to item 6. The strengthening of the standards and conduct of framework for the local authorities in England. the outcome of the government consultation. Adrian, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. Tonight's report is brought to this committee so that I can bring you the summary of the government's response to the recent consultation on strengthening the standards and conduct framework. Strengthening the framework is something that we've looked at this committee on a number of occasions, most recently back in January last year, when this committee approved the proposed response to the consultation. And now, a year later, we've completed the consultation and we've got the government's thoughts on the responses that it's had. So there are 9 key points I wanted to talk you through this evening to give you the flavour of where the government is intending to take these proposed reforms. So if I run through those, Chair, if that's okay, just to run through the 9 areas, and then I'll take any questions from there.
Adrian, thanks.
The first one is about the code of conduct. At the moment, we have a local code of conduct in Kent, which is common to most of the boroughs, districts and the county. There are 1 or 2 deviations from that, but on the whole, Kent has a code that's been agreed county-wide. The government's view following consultation is that there should be a national mandatory code of conduct. That's not a great surprise. That's something that they've been heading towards for some time now. And the consultation responses confirmed that a vast majority of respondents agreed. So 94% of respondents agreed that there should be a mandatory code. So that's where we're going in terms of the government's position. The government is going to prescribe what that code looks like. My expectation is it probably look quite similar to the one produced fairly recently within the past few years by the Local Government Association. So I don't know for sure, but I think that's where this may go. There will be scope, the government says, for local authorities to develop their own guidance and protocols to go alongside the code of conduct, but they won't be part of the code itself. So if we were to develop our own protocols, they would have to sit outside of the code and really just be help to inform the council's position on standards. So that's point 1. The second point was the requirement to have a standards committee. And obviously, we're sat here tonight and we do have a standards committee, but many councils don't and haven't had for some time. And the government feels that this should change and there should be a requirement for all councils to have a standards committee. What that means in terms of the makeup of the committee, I don't know. Obviously, it will need to be politically balanced. We'll see, really, the detail will be in the legislation about how that is to be made up. But one thing we do know is that the government doesn't intend for the independent person to become the chair of the standards committee. For members who've been on this committee and for a number of years, you may recall that the regime we had pre the Localism Act, there was a requirement to have an independent person chair the standards committee. They weren't technically the same independent person that we've had since, which has its own specific responsibilities. But the government still is keen on the idea of the chair of the committee being independent, but they don't regard it as being compatible with the independent person role that we have at the moment, because they have a specific role in advising on complaints that we receive and providing advice and assistance to members who are the subject of complaints. So that was the standards committee. Moving on to code of conduct complaint process. The next part of the government response relates to publication of code of conduct allegations. Now, again, you'll see from the agenda tonight that we've got a paper outlining in summary the complaints we've had during 2025, but we do not name either the complainant or the councillor against whom the complaint is made unless the complaint proceeds to a hearing before the standards hearing panel and a decision that the code has been breached. The government intention is to go along similar lines in that only if there's been a full investigation and a hearing before the Standards Committee will the government require that details of that complaint are published. Now, what we've done in our report elsewhere on this agenda is we provide details of all complaints that have been made, but for those that you'll see tonight, because they haven't passed the initial assessment phase, we do not name either the complainant or the councillor against whom the complaint is made. And the government isn't proposing to change that. So really the process we've adopted is pretty consistent with what the government intends to legislate for. The next point is one that is different, which is that government intends to legislate so that if a complaint is made against a councillor, that the investigation of that complaint can continue even if the councillor has resigned from their position. Now, I think this is probably a reflection of the fact that sanctions are to be reintroduced to the standards process as they were many years ago. Our existing complaints process, the initial assessment stage, provides that if a councillor has ceased to be a councillor at the point when we determine the complaint, then that complaint won't pass the initial assessment stage. But the government proposes to change that so that the investigation can continue. The fifth point again relates to the process for complaints, and this is going to be a very new for everybody in that the government intends to legislate to provide both the complainant and the councillor against whom the complaint is made the right to review Standards Committee investigation determinations. Now, that's something that doesn't happen at the moment. There is a right to take a matter to the local government and social care ombudsman, but that's not for them to review the decision. That's only if you believe there's been a fault in the process or the councillor is somehow guilty of maladministration. But the government intends to change that to provide more comfort both for complainants and for subject members, councillors against whom the complaint are made, that they can review those decisions. Now, that right to review is going to be a local level review. I'll come on in a moment to talk about appeals, but there is to be a local level review process. And the government has also said they will set out the eligibility criteria for right to review decisions. So you'd have to meet one of the criteria in order to ask for the decision to be reviewed. They're also going to include recommended actions to support people affected by the complaint and investigation process. And the driver for this, and you'll see in the government response, is that some people feel quite exposed by the standards process. And I think particularly in parish councils, where if the clerk has a falling out or feels that they are being mistreated by a member of the parish council or particularly the chair, they feel quite vulnerable in bringing forward a complaint. So the government wants to introduce some actions to support anybody who's going through that process. I don't know what these will look like at the moment, but that's something they've said they're going to do in their response. The sixth point relates to the power to suspend, and this is really the meat of the response, because one of the complaints that the government's had for many years, or governments have had for a number of years, and came out through the consultation, was that there should be a power to suspend the worst offending councillors. So the government has said that it intends to legislate to provide authorities with the power to suspend for serious code of conduct breaches for up to 6 months. And it is going to be reserved for the most serious breaches. We don't yet know what the specific detail of those will be, So there'll be power to suspend for up to 6 months. There will also be power to withhold allowances and institute premises and facilities bans where appropriate alongside that. Now, the power to suspend will only be able to be taken by a standards committee following an investigation report and following receipt of the views of the independent person. So it has to go through that entire process before a decision to suspend can be taken. Now, elsewhere in the consultation, the government talked about appeals, and they recognise, and this came out through the consultation in the responses, they recognise there is a risk of allegations that, in local government terms, allegations that the Standards Committee wasn't politically neutral, and therefore that there could be some allegations that if you're a member of one party, that the majority party took a particular decision because they are a different political colour to your group. So they are going to introduce provisions for a national appeals body. And this only relates to, again, the most serious cases. But where a case has been through the right to review and it meets the criteria for a further appeal through to a national appeals body, then that body can review, so for example, a suspension and determine where to go from there. Again, with suspensions, the government intends to legislate to give local authorities power to place a councillor on interim suspension, but this only will exist in response to very serious code of conduct allegations that are subject to external investigation by the police, for example. And this is to allow the police investigation to continue, but suspend the councillor whilst that investigation is ongoing. So it will only be for 3 months, and then there'll be further detail about whether that interim suspension can be extended after the 3-month period, which I imagine will be dependent on where the police have got to with their investigation. And then final point for me relates to disqualification, and the government intends to introduce this power through legislation. And again, it will only be for the very serious cases. So if a councillor has been subject to 2 suspensions of the maximum 6 months each during a 5-year period, then they would be disqualified. Now, why 5 years? You might ask. Well, the government's view is that because electoral terms are 4 years, this allows the 5-year period to straddle 2 terms in case one person is subject to 2 suspensions during that time. But clearly this is for the very, very serious cases. So I imagine it will be very sparingly engaged as a power, because you would have had to have been disqualified twice in the previous 5 years for your conduct. Chair, those are the principal points I was going to draw out, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Please.
Thank you. Interesting debate tonight. Of course, this is really, really, really late, isn't it? I mean, bearing in mind they've been councillors for years and all of a sudden they decide. But just out of interest, in the case of a real severe problem, and someone is suspended for 6 months, where does that sit with our 6 month and you must turn up for a meeting? How does that work with that? Because you've got a 6 month suspension. I mean, are you physically still a councillor, but you're suspended? Or are you not a councillor and you've got 6 months of that period where you should turn up at meetings? Are you with me?
Yeah, I'm just going to try and find the bit in the government response, because they did mention the link between this and the 6 month rule for a disqualification, because I'm sure members are familiar with this, but if not, the position is that if you do not attend a council meeting for 6 months, then you are automatically disqualified unless the councillors agree that that period can be extended. But there was something in the consultation about this. Just bear with me. Oh, here we go. Oh, that's the interim suspension. Beg your pardon. No, actually, I can't find it. It's mentioned in relation to the interim suspension because there were responses making that point, which is if you're suspended for 6 months, you may end up by default being disqualified. So this is something I think we'll have to wait and see what legislation says, because it would seem to be contrary to the spirit of the proposals to suspend somebody for 6 months and then by default they are then disqualified as a councillor. So maybe it will be 6 months minus, well, it couldn't even be 6 months minus 1 day because you'd have to have a council meeting to go to. So yeah, if I can come back to you once I see the detailed legislation on that one, Councillor Rhodes.
Adrian.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I've mentioned this briefly in connection with the previous report, but this is the update for this committee on the complaints that we dealt with during 2025. I think I probably say this whenever I introduce this report, but much of the work that happens in relation to standards, and in particular code of conduct complaints, happens outside of this formal Joint Standards Committee meeting, because we receive complaints throughout the year that fall to me as monitoring officer to progress in consultation with the chair and vice chair and our 2 independent persons. It is important that we bring this to you for transparency, so that you can see what type of complaints we are receiving. As I mentioned earlier, we don't name the complainant, we don't name the subject member where the complaints don't progress to an investigation and a hearing before the standards hearing panel. But for 2025, we didn't have any complaints that progressed to a standards hearing panel. We did have 6 complaints that were assessed under our initial assessment procedure. 3 of those related to Waterbury Parish Council and 3 related to Tunbridge and Morling members. Well, in one case, Tunbridge and Morling and a KCC member. We had 4 complaints that were made to me that didn't progress because the complainant had requested that their personal details were anonymous. Our policy within the adopted arrangements is not to accept requests for anonymity unless certain criteria are met. Because when we receive a complaint, we share that complaint with the elected member, and we also name the person that's made the complaint. One of the reasons really is to stop potentially vexatious complaints against an elected member, and while someone remains anonymous. So there are other criteria as well. But we did have 4 complaints last year where the complainant requested that they remain anonymous. It wasn't that we felt the complaints were vexatious, but there were other criteria that we felt were met that wouldn't allow us to accept that those complaints were anonymous. So in total, we had 10 complaints last year that we dealt with. Of the 6 that we've got on the paper here, you'll see the resolution for all of those. 1 went to informal resolution. The rest were either rejected under the initial assessment process, or we directed the complainant to another body, such as the auditors for the parish council or the information commissioner. And we also had one complainant that went to the local government ombudsman that we had to deal with their complaints as well. So that was it, Chair. Thank you. Nothing further to add on that.
Thanks. Any questions? Any questions at all? No, well, thank you very much indeed, Adrian. That's a very comprehensive report. Thanks. Moving on then to item 8. Yes, I have it carefully in front of me on page 29. Members are asked us to note the outcome of complaints assessed by the monitoring officer since the previous date to this committee on the 20th January. Noted. Thank you. Moving on then, item 8. We have no urgent items to be discussed. Item 9, there's no reason to exclude the press and public because we had no urgent items under part 2 and no part 2 items. I therefore close the meeting at 7:56. And thank you all for coming. And thank you, Adrian, for putting all the reports together.